Prova, sa, 1, 2, 3, prova.
Ah, te c'è anche io sono il PDF. Pensavo.
Lui ce l'ha mandata.
Sì, c'è visto il PDF.
Però insomma ho pensato che sì, sono developmenti di relazioni internazionali. Dunque parliamo inglese?
Non so chi è la passatrice.
Io devo attaccare in inglese? Certo. Anche perché la maggioranza allora, mi sentite? Sì, spero. Mi tolgo la maschera perché dovrebbe funzionare un po' meglio anche per il nostro ospite a distanza, quindi chi parla magari si leva la maschera e chi non parla sa. Allora, benvenute a questo ultimo incontro, ultimo per Roma 3, qui abbiamo anche il nostro patron Giorgio Bartolomucci che insomma mi confermi che siamo proprio in chiusura del festival. È l'ultimo evento, quindi siamo particolarmente orgogliosi, visto che ormai siamo diventati partner a Roma 3 del Festival della Diplomazia, di ospitare l'ultimo evento di questa edizione che è giunta alla dodicesimo anno e per Roma 3 il 10°. Stavamo giusto contando da quando abbiamo avviato insieme al professor Nuti, un caro collega e amico che siede qui al mio fianco e che molti di voi conoscono, abbiamo anni e anni fa questa collaborazione che si è trasformata in un appuntamento fisso. Ormai Roma 3 ospita il Dipartimento di Scienze Politiche, in particolar modo ospita questo evento con regolarità. E abbiamo scelto tra l'altro con un titolo decisamente provocatorio che viene da un libro, The Stupidity of War, e il ritorno delle grandi potenze, di cui l'autore è John Mueller, il professor John Mueller che abbiamo in collegamento. John, you're hearing us, right? We'll be speaking both English and here he is. Okay. Welcome. Okay. It's a pleasure to have you online, connected with our students here. For the most part, we have students of the two graduate programs in International Studies e Relazioni Internazionali in Italian, one in English. They are in Italian, and other students from the Department of Political Science. Unfortunately, we had to limit access due to the anti-COVID-19 measures that we had to take in the department. It's a great pleasure also to have on my right Ambassador Mirakian of Armenian origins, she's telling me. It's a great pleasure to have her here. We'll be speaking sia italiano che inglese, switching da una lingua all'altra, come sto facendo adesso. In order to basically to keep John involved, Professor Mueller involved, your Italian still needs some, I understand, some brushing up and improvement, but so you will pardon me if we'll switch now and then to Italian as well. So toward the end of the meeting, when we'll have the students in case participate, if you don't feel comfortable enough, because we expect the questions and comments from you. Of course, it's a great opportunity to have two prominent
I can't hear anything at my end.
Can you hear?
Now I can, yes, I wasn't able a minute ago.
Okay. So I was saying that your book is really an attempt at looking at international relations and American foreign policy from a different perspective, basically. The idea that many of the wars the United States was engaged in, especially during the Cold War and afterwards, were probably not necessary, at least that's how, well, he'll tell us more about this topic, of course. But I think that the presence of Ambassador Mirakian, who has been been in the witness, fought in the Balkans and in the Middle East, right, in Syria, is a great opportunity to hear directly from the voice of someone who has witnessed wars and be present during such tragic events. It's an excellent opportunity. So I'll try to keep it short because we have three speakers. Unfortunately, Ambassador Camporini couldn't be with us today because of, for health reasons, nothing serious, but he cannot be here nor connected. I briefly introduce Professor John Mueller, who is Professor of Political Science and Senior Research Scientist at the Merchant Center for International Security Studies. He has written a great deal about international relations, books such as with Mark Stewart, Chasing Ghosts, The Policy of Terrorism, published in 2016, War Presidents and Public Opinion, Retreat from Doomsday, The Obsolescence of Major War, again. So he has come over again on this topic, he has covered this topic, and especially also from the point of view of American foreign policy and in general on international relations. I will, in case, say a few more things because I teach this semester the course. Several of my students are here together with our colleague Daniela Huber, who teaches international politics. So this is absolutely a topic that fits in our program in international studies, and especially in our three courses, because Professor Nuti, as you know, teaches the history of international relations after the end of the Cold War. I do the United States and the world in the 20th and 21st century. So basically, this is the event that is perfectly in tune with our courses. And I hope the students will enjoy this and will find this opportunity interesting. Now, since we took part of the title for this event from John Mueller's book, as I was saying before, without any further ado, I would just turn to John Mueller and ask him to give an introduction of the topic of today so that we can then hear Ambassador Mirakian and then Professor Nuti in order. And then in case, as I was saying, I will add a few remarks also because the chapters, as you flip through the book, the chapters are basically a list of American wars, American interventions overseas in basically between the Cold War and the post-Cold War period. John, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Yes, I'd like to summarize the book and also look at the current situation in Afghanistan. The book basically is built around the notion that attitudes toward war have changed enormously over the last century. Before the First World War, it was extremely common, very easy to find intellectuals as well as military people and politicians who talked about war in the most favorable terms. They saw it as beautiful, holy, sacred, progressive, heroic, glorious, romantic, and argued that human progress was dependent on war. I was quite surprised when I looked into this, into the literature before World War II in Europe and in North America. But it's extremely easy to find somebody writing an article, for example, in a British journal a theologian, and the title of the journal is God's Purpose by War. What's really good about war and why God wants us to fight wars. That changed completely after the First World War. It's almost impossible to find anybody saying that in Europe or North America after World War I. One of the rare exceptions is Benito Mussolini. But I found maybe one or two additional Europeans or Americans or North Americans saying things like that. Instead, there was a major change, as several historians have pointed out, after World War I, to try to get rid of war, mainly thinking about international war, not so much civil war. And so the League of Nations was founded, war was outlawed. There was various arguments put together for arbitration and so forth after that time. So a peace movement, or the basic idea that war is really, really stupid, was really created and developed at that time. That didn't stop, obviously, World War II. The war in Europe, it seems to me, would not have happened. It was not destined by any means. It would not have happened without Adolf Hitler. If he'd been run over by a truck, the world would have been celebrating, I think, 100 years. Europe would be celebrating 100 years of independence from international war in 2018. In fact, I wrote an article for the warontherocks.com that came out on November 11th, 2018, which basically talks about how without Hitler, it would have been 100 years of war, absent of international war in Europe. But anyway, now getting into the current era, after World War II, the same attitude prevailed, and this time there was no Hitler. And so what we have now gotten into since 1945 is something completely unprecedented in history, the complete absence of international war in Europe, or in fact, among developed states. Europe, which takes the lead in this, and Europe, which used to be the most warlike of continents before World War I, has had no substantial civil wars, no substantial international wars for 75 years. That's probably the longest period of time that has happened since the concept of Europe was invented about 2,500 years ago. That is also included then not only just Europe and North America, but developed states in general. There's been essentially no substantial wars for 75 years between developed states. There were international wars for a while after World War II outside the developed world. Israel fought the Arab states a few times, Italy, Pakistan and India, of course, fought a few wars, but those basically died out. And so even outside the developed world, international war has become really very uncommon. There were some really bad wars, including the one between Iran and Iraq during that time, so there were some. But in the last 30 years, there have only been maybe four, at the most, four international wars. One was between Ethiopia and Eritrea at the very end of the 20th century. The other are the two wars started by the United States after 9/11, one in Iraq to take out Saddam Hussein, and one in Taliban to go after Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. In addition, there's a war last year between Nagorno-Karabakh between Azerbaijan and Armenia, which lasted a very short period of time, and may be considered a civil war rather than an international war. So we're living in a condition, I think, which is likely to hold for a long time, in which international war, in which countries do not use international war as a method for conducting their international relations. This is basically a complete change from millennia, in which war, of course, international war is extremely common. There are some places where there are some issues, however, that are important in this. There are a lot of efforts to to do things to other countries, but they don't involve direct warfare. For example, there's military interventions in civil wars, as we see in Syria, Libya, and in Yemen. These were very destructive and extended the civil wars, but I think were basically, I hope, anomalies. In other words, they will not continue, but nonetheless, that is being done. Sometimes those are called proxy wars, but they're not direct wars between developed states. Secondly, there's a lot of use of economic sanctions, and some people call that economic warfare. I don't, because the military is obviously not involved, but they can also be pretty painful, and they're mostly not very effective at changing policy. There's also been a large number of border conflicts, maybe 100 of them since 1945. But these are increasingly being conducted at a very low level in areas of dispute between countries which do not have soldiers on them and are not populated. Indeed, the most recent experience of this was a short conflict between India and Pakistan, between India and China last year, and the soldiers did not have weapons. They were disarmed because the countries did not want to see those wars escalate to real wars. So I think what has happened is that we're living in a time in which there's things going on. There's cyber warfare, if you want to count that, that are happening. But what we're not having is what used to be called international wars in the ordinary sense. Okay, so that's one part of the book, namely the tracing of this change of attitude toward a sense of international peace, a lack of international war, though there are these interventions and things like that I mentioned. At the present time, the book is also extremely interested in the issue of threat perceptions, and it spends a lot of time dealing with what have been seen to be international threats during the Cold War and after. At the present time, my argument is that there really aren't any substantial international threats for which large military is required. I think China and Russia do not have any kind of idea about expanding in a Hitlerian manner. They're not Hitler states. The one exception to that would probably be China's desire to get Taiwan back. They want to play a larger role in the international arena, as they are now, with respect to the settlement in Afghanistan, but they don't want to expand militarily. They want to increase their influence and things like that. The other countries, such as North Korea, are basically protecting themselves, are not interested in expanding internationally. Iran plays some games in civil wars around the country and is obviously hostile to Israel, but hasn't attacked anybody militarily in hundreds of years. There's also the problem of nuclear proliferation, but nuclear proliferation has been remarkably mild. Since 1945, nobody has been killed by a nuclear weapon, but hundreds of thousands of people have been killed by efforts to prevent nuclear proliferation through wars and especially through economic sanctions on Iraq. And so that doesn't seem to be that much of a problem. And international terrorism, I think, has been massively exaggerated in terms of the effect. I've written several books about this, as Steve pointed out. And basically, Al-Qaeda should be put down, I think, as a failure with one success. In many respects, Al-Qaeda Central has proven to be very much like Lee Harvey Oswald, the man who assassinated John Kennedy. It is a country, it is a essentially trivial entity that got horribly lucky once. The attacks on 9/11 were the worst terrorist attacks in history, and to explain that more, there's never been a terrorist attack before or after 9/11 in war zones or outside of war zones that caused even 1/10 as much total destruction. So it's very much an outlier, an extreme case. Okay, let me conclude then with the situation about, there's also the title of the talk about great power, realignment, and so forth. I've never been terribly happy with the phrase great power. I'm not sure what that means all the time. But it certainly seems, insofar as there are great powers, they're determined not to get into wars with each other, though they may play unpleasant games around the edges that I've already suggested. But I think the greatest of the great powers, I suppose, is the United States. And it's undergoing what I hope will be a very pleasant leveling as it becomes more humble in foreign policy and less arrogant. Neither the wars in Iraq nor the war in Afghanistan were required by the United States. Could have gone after Al-Qaeda. It almost certainly could have gotten the Taliban to turn over Osama bin Laden if it had worked with its allies like Pakistan and Saudi Arabia in that area. In the case of the war against Iraq, the argument was that Saddam Hussein was going to be it was going to dominate the Middle East with his pathetic, small, ridiculous army, which was a preposterous conclusion. And I think both wars were profoundly stupid in the sense that they were taken for very bad reasons. And of course, neither of those two wars would have happened had the United States, had 9/11 not happened. There's only been 2 international wars since in the last 30 years, not 4. So let me conclude on that. It seems to me that we're in a situation which is likely to continue for a long time unless people, the United States or other countries, screw it up, in which international relations will continue. There are plenty of international problems, but they're not ones that can be cured by tanks or military forces. There's obviously the pandemic. There's obviously economic problems. There's obviously concerns about climate change and so forth. And there also, I think, an emerging problem is the criminalization of many countries, particularly in Latin America and Afghanistan, in which criminal gangs are basically running the countries. Those are not international war problems. They're not military problems. They're important policing problems. So there's plenty of problems out there, but there are none, it seems to me, that require a large military force in being. So let me end on that, and I'm happy to discuss more as questions arise and other comments are made. Thank you.
Thank you, John. This was a very interesting approach and perspective, very much along.
Okay.
It's not working? It's working. It should be working. Okay. Along, of course, the chapters of your book, as you said, as you concluded, there are other kinds of issues that are not just, that don't require those kind of solutions necessarily, and things, of course, can be handled in a different way. Okay, let's now turn to Ambassador Laura Mirakian, I'm sorry. Mirakian.
I-A-N, it's son of.
Okay. Mirakian, who is actually, I mean, this should interest students. She graduated in political science. So, there is a future there when you get a degree in political. We all 3 graduated in political science. So, and she started working for the cooperation service for the developing countries, and then moved to the general directions for economic affairs of the European Community. She's always worked basically for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and in 1992 she became first Chancellor and Chargé d'Affaires in Belgrade, and Yeah. Your bio. Let's make it very short. She was also in Syria during the
ambassador,
conflict, so
okay.
as ambassador, and she
in
witnessed
the
to
UN.
and to the UN. And she witnessed to major conflicts, which is the reason why also she's here with us today. Ambassador Mirakian.
Thank you very much, everybody, for inviting me. I hope that you don't regret it. I asked the students here present here, would you prefer one page with 4 points or 3 very boring pages?
3 very boring pages.
Okay. So we start from the title of this seminar that I didn't like at all, because having served in wars areas, I know what war is, and I don't want to joke on this wording. Okay. Rather, the question that I was asking myself, what was going wrong in this story, Afghanistan story? Were the goals wrong, or wrong was the way we have been pushing the goals? I don't have an answer. Maybe both, maybe none. The facts, you know the facts, you know? 9/11, US was attacked for the first time at home, And the Americans had to do something. And they decided they invented 2 wars. The first was 2001, Afghanistan, and then after a while, 2003, Iraq. Afghanistan was, of course, motivated by the fact that, Afghanistan was hosting these Al-Qaeda people and so on and so forth. But nevertheless, I like to mention what Henry Kissinger and Richard Holbrooke said about this war. I consider both my teachers, brilliant diplomats. Kissinger said, the military objectives had been too absolute and unattainable, and the political ones too abstract and elusive. I agree, especially with the second part of this sentence. Holbrooke said, we are fighting a wrong war in a wrong place, referring to the Pakistan role, hosting, all kind of Taliban and non-Taliban component, Afghani component. And he was also referring to the fact that Pakistan had been dealing with the West usual, at the same time hosting and connecting with Talibans and others at home. You may be heard on television, or you read on newspapers that the Europeans were not happy at all about the way the Americans were not. Sì,
Yeah,
it's on.
It should be working.
Bene. And they claim that the Americans didn't consult them, they didn't tell, they went away without saying anything and so on. So I went deeper on that. And, you know, I read that April the 12th in Brussels, there was Sembra farnesina. Ah, perfetto. So I was saying, on the April the 12th, the Jumbo Council, NATO Jumbo Council, Defense Foreign Affairs, met and decided literally we will coordinate withdrawal in together, out together, and we will leave on May the 1st. So it was stated officially at the meeting where all the Europeans, NATO European countries were there. So, you know, we will come back to this later on. The relations between the Americans and the Europeans nowadays, it's more difficult than before. On the same occasion, April the 12th, Blinken and Biden and Blinken, declared that NATO objectives have been achieved. Because in principle, as a matter of principle, we went there because of Al-Qaeda, Bin Laden, and so on and so forth. Bin Laden was killed in Pakistan at the beginning of 2011. And so, after 10 years, the two declared that the NATO objectives have been achieved. This is very ambiguous because according to the Americans, the objective was exactly this: defeat Al-Qaeda and terrorism where it is. Taliban were hosting and they were very close to Al-Qaeda, and they still are. According to the Europeans, there was something more. As usual, there was a kind of division of tasks between the Europeans and the Americans. The Americans are, well, the military one, are leading the military line, and the Europeans try to, of course, they participate in the military, but also they try to have some nation building, or better, institution building, which means that all the civilian part of the operation was, let's say, quite important for the Europeans, less important for the Americans. And this is one of the problems, among others. Allora, vi risparmio invece che cosa ha detto il capo di Stato Maggiore Generale Mark Milley al Senato l'altro giorno, cioè alla fine di questo ritiro. Ma in sintesi, when Biden became president, he said, US had 3,500 troops, NATO 5,400 troops. He decided to withdraw not by May the 1st, as it was said in April, but by September 11, to recall, no? It was actually quite a good idea. But Kabul falls on August 15. And so the withdrawal was fixed on August 31st. The same general said it was possible, because this is another claim by the Europeans, no? Why don't we stay a little bit more? Because all this crowd at the airport, you know, this difficulty in, you know, managing the crowd that wanted to go out of the country. So the same general said to maintain the Bagram base, which was a military base, the biggest military base close to Kabul, covering the operation of the, the Afghani army. To maintain this base would have required sending additional 5,000 troops. And to delay the withdrawal would have meant 20,000 soldiers more. And his comment was, this was certainly possible from the military point of view, but it was too costly from a political point of view. So the Americans decided that not to prolong, not to delay the withdrawal, because it couldn't send the delay at home. And because the popularity, the credibility of the president, the same president, would have been jeopardized. But these are details. But to explain, this difference of perception and difference also of interest in this specific scenario between the Europeans and the Americans, why the Afghani army collapsed suddenly, because as Biden said afterwards, we didn't expect such a rapid collapse of the Afghani army, which was trained, which was equipped, which was, well trained and so on, and they collapsed suddenly. So everybody's asking why. How was it? Well, I was asking to myself, and I found at least 4 reasons. The first 2 are technical reasons. The Bagram base that I mentioned before has been dismantled. So they had, military speaking, sorry that Camporini is not with us, military speaking, they had no cover from the aviation and so on, because this was dealt with by Americans. The plane were with the Afghani pilots, but the base organizing logistics and the flights and so on and so forth were controlled by the Americans. The second is also a technical thing, but not so technical. I think that the army was discouraged very much by the fact that the announcement of the withdrawal has been done months before. So for months they were preoccupied. The Americans are going. The NATO is going away. It's finished. How can we manage that? But the third, more important reason, it's a political reason. Why should I die for President Ghani, who is on the way to escape, to go out of Afghanistan? So the credibility and legitimacy of the president, and also, I would say, the local governors around in the country, who were nominated by the president, were extremely low. Why should I die for them? There is a fourth very important that people, at least experts, tend to put aside because it's not a good. During 20 years of the NATO-US operation, the Taliban, they were never defeated, never. They went on fighting. Of course, where it was easier to fight, which was in this immense countryside, outside the big cities. The big cities in Afghanistan are 4. Kabul, Herat, where we were, and you know, Sharif 4. In any case, there is an immense outskirt, countryside, which none, as far as I know, it was not under attention, under Western attention. The Taliban, they maintained their contacts, they maintained their credibility, let's say, and at the end of the story, people had to choose between the legitimacy of the official institutions, Ghani and his governors, and the legitimacy or credibility of the Taliban chief. And they choose the second one. And this is why the army collapsed. It's not collapsed. They didn't fight. As simple as that. So I don't know if these motivations are correct from others' point of view, but this is what my, let's say, analysis resulting from my analysis, or personal analysis. The impact of this withdrawal. The first, I would put the first women. I mean, women are entering, or did enter, into a nightmare because repression is fierce, ferocious. And they're not able to figure out what their future will be. But in any case, from time to time, you know, some head is cut here and there. And it's not just that they cannot go to work unless they are, you know, specialized in certain medical doctors, which is related to women, and so on and so forth. In any case, you know, it's a separation between sex, clear cut. Second is that this state, Afghanistan, nobody can guarantee minimal essential services to the people. There is a humanitarian crisis, huge humanitarian crisis, in the sense that people cannot eat. And there is, as Draghi said at the end of the G20 meeting, there is a high risk of immediate economic collapse. Humanitarian, economic, financial catastrophe. The third element, the third say, impact, I would say, women, the humanitarian economic crisis, and the third is, well, the American credibility around the world, which was already quite diminishing. But this chaos at the airport and people desperately trying to leave was having a very important impact on the US credibility in general and possibly on Biden's reputation at home. Biden, how do you say, the sondaggi di opinione, opinion polls are decreasing, the popularity is decreasing, and on this occasion, it was decreasing very much. Of course, the Republicans will take advantage of this. We have elections coming soon, and so we don't know. The fourth impact is that this failure is opening, makes more difficult, I would say almost impossible for the moment, any stabilization plan. And will open the way to the neighborhood, to the countries of the neighborhood. Not all of them are very sympathetic with the West. And I stop there. Fifth impact, internally, the possibility of a real civil war between Taliban themselves, between the Pashir, Uzbeki, Tajiki, and the Talibans. You know, the Pashir Valley, which was resisting the Taliban at that time. And between, above all, Talibans and all the rest that I mentioned, and the so-called Khorasan K, ISIS K, ISIS Khorasan. Khorasan is a very wide region going from the border with Iran, actually part of Khorasan is in Iran also, and up to Himalaya, Central Asia. So the project of these people, which are, you know, using terrorist practices, is to have to rehabilitate the historical region of Khorasan, which is the one that I was mentioning, very wide. And so everybody around is very worried about this, not only for the methodology that they are using, which is very terrorist, possibly more than the Taliban themselves, but also because the project is a revolutionary one, would, you know, create crisis everywhere. They are around 10,000 people. Who are these people? I'm speaking about ISIS Khorasan now. Who are they? Ooh, it's a very a variety of different components of the Afghani society, and the surrounding countries as well. So the dissenting Talibans, the Pakistani Talibans, the Chinese minority Uyghuri, I don't know if you heard about, the East Turkestan Islamic movement called Etim, and then ethnic Tajiki, Uzbeki, Checheni, and so on and so forth. Obviously, newspapers are speaking also, our newspaper. They are not very specialized. Our newspaper are speaking also of Syrians in the middle of all these Central Asian people. I don't think so, but it's possible. You know, people, speaking about the Syrians, you know, which are used as mercenaries, as you know, no? Here and there by Turkey or somebody else, Moscow, Russia. The problem is having a salary. We never think, we think about ideology, no? They don't join ISIS for ideology. They join ISIS because it's a possibility to have a salary as a mercenary. And I think that among these people in Afghanistan and surrounded, more or less the logic is the same. It's not a big Khorasan that is the idea of a big Khorasan which is attracting. It's maybe salary, I don't know. In any case, they attacked the Taliban, and the day after the Americans left, and they are still attacking 3 minuti, eccetera. Allora, do you know how much only the Americans have been allocating for this Afghani operation? Well, $3 trillion. 3 trillion dollars. Which means, this is what Biden said, 300 million a day. 300 million a day. Okay, 3 minutes now, the strategic autonomy, but if I have to stop, I will stop. But somebody of you, please now ask me a very important question. What about the European strategic autonomy? What will be, because all the story was accelerating the discussion in Brussels about European strategic autonomy. The Americans, we cannot follow anymore their drive. Their project is not necessarily coinciding exactly with our projects. The problem of China, and so on and so forth. Now this Afghanistan thing. Strategic autonomy is becoming, for the Europeans at the moment, in Brussels, a central topic. 500 citizens, European citizens, were called to participate in the European Union platform organized from Brussels, and Italy is participating. If you click on this platform, you will see, you know, people writing in Greek, people writing Lithuanian, people writing in German. Yeah, people write, only the Italians are so good as to write in English. But all the rest are using, you know, their own language, which means something, in any case. The second question that you should ask me, it's about the G20 that Draghi organized on October the 12th. And the subsequent meeting that Moscow organized on October the 20th. What does it mean? 2 meetings? 3 meetings, because Iran also? Okay, you are bored enough, and I will stop here. You made the wrong choice, because I could have, you know, just 4 points here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yes, well, you raised some important issues concerning, of course, Afghanistan, but there are a lot, of course, also related to the way the United States have approached over time the different engagements overseas, and how it has sometimes mismanaged these interventions, also because the nation building intentions or processes were actually there, but at the same time they were not. I mean, this is a big discussion about how the United States approaches, in general, commitment overseas and engagement in foreign wars. Let's turn to Leopoldo Nuti, our last speaker for today, and then we'll open the floor to questions and discussion. Leopoldo Nuti is a professor of in the history of international relations here at the Università Roma III, but he has also taught in Catania before this, and in Florence you were as well, and graduated in political science, as I mentioned before, and has worked a lot on Italian-US relations, but especially in the last years on the nuclear power and the nuclear order, quote unquote, during the Cold War, especially with Michael and Onderko. He published a book, Extending the NPT, A Critical Oral History of the 1995 Review and Extension Conference, and with David Holloway, The Making of the Global Nuclear Order in the 1970s, and much more. And many of you already know him because he's your professor, I believe. So, Leopoldo.
Thank you, Daniele. Thanks for the organizers of this event. It's become a ritual appointment every year to meet here to discuss some of the hot topics of the day, thanks to the Festival of Diplomacy. In my own intervention, I would like to briefly discuss some of the more theoretical issues. Ambassador Mirakian focused on Afghanistan. I would like to go back to some of the important issues that John Mueller raised in his intervention about the stupidity of war and the possible return to great power conflict. And the first comment I want to make is that whenever I hear or read something from John, I always find it very refreshing, because it's not common to read an American scholar who puts so much emphasis on, who tries to de-emphasize the military dimensions of security. Most of the American IR literature you will come across puts so much emphasis on this military dimension of security that it is somewhat, if not misleading, I think it contributes to give you a skewed perspective on how the international system works. So John provides you with the alternative, if you want, an international system where the aversion to war is so deeply ingrained into the system that most military adventures or expenditures look basically unnecessary or misleading. Which I think it's a useful way to try to balance the previous perspective. As a historian, however, let me try to come up with some plausible explanation for how we got here. How did we get the United States to be so obsessively attached to this overemphasis on the military dimension of international security? And I think, and I'm not going to say anything particularly regional here, but this is, if you want, we're still living through, when we read about the importance of military power to stabilize the international system, we're still living through the lessons of the 1930s. The 1920s and the 1930s were the interwar period when the great powers thought that a thoroughly demilitarized international system could sort out most of its problems, that the League of Nations could ensure peace and stability, and that the horrors of World War I had taught everybody a lesson, so that we wouldn't go through that ordeal again. Then came World War II, and everything that had happened in the 1920s, and particularly in the 1930s, with the logic of appeasement, clearly became a symbol of everything that was wrong in the international system. So the lessons of the 1930s quickly became that if you wanted to stabilize the international system, you had to have an overwhelming military power. Trusting the goodwill of the other countries was not enough. Trusting international institutions to ensure peace and stability was not enough. The only way to prevent World War III was to be incredibly more powerful than... Wow. Okay, back to normality, I hope. Okay. All right, back to where we were. Sorry. That was rather scary, talking about bombs and to have something like that going on. Okay. Somehow, the United States becoming the key central pillar of the international order after 1945 took this lesson to its heart and attributed so much importance to becoming the overwhelming power that you can see the whole logic of the nuclear age as a consequence of this. The search for the ultimate weapon, the weapon that would guarantee you the power to be always one step ahead of your opponents. And in a way, there is something inherently American in this logic. And it's, if you want, the other side of the coin. On the one hand, you have this self-perception of the United States as a country that doesn't like to go to war and that's strongly isolationist. And on the other hand, you have a country that feels safe only if it is much more powerful than everybody else around it. And the idea that you can live in a world where other countries are as powerful as you is profoundly disquieting to the US. It's something that, due to its history and its logic, the United States as a great power is not used to. For the short time in which the United States felt it had to live through some kind of parity with the Soviet Union in the 1970s and the 1980s, it was profoundly uneasy about this idea. So the whole strategic mission of the United States was always to regain the upper hand and to feel like the ultimate pillar of stability in the international system. Now, John is telling us that this is all wrong, basically, because this whole perception of how essential it is to be more powerful than everybody else is unnecessary, because the result of World War I and World War II is this deeply ingrained aversion to war that has spread across the international system, which makes most military expenditures unnecessary. Here, and I mean, John goes through a very lengthy discussion about this in the last part of his book, which I encourage you to read. This is a rather controversial issue to prove. You have to prove a negative. There was no major international war since 1945. Why did this happen? Because people learned that war is stupid, and the great powers learned the lesson of World War II, or because other factors prevented the great powers from going to war. And John has written at length about the essential irrelevance of nuclear weapons. And I, for one, am not necessarily persuaded that nuclear deterrence is the key element that prevented World War III. Yet I always feel uneasy at stressing that nuclear weapons were essentially irrelevant. There were times during the Cold War that we came very, very close to a confrontation between the two superpowers, and the Cuban Missile Crisis is the ultimate example of this. And maybe, even though it is extremely difficult to prove a negative, maybe nuclear weapons were the ultimate reason why during those crises we didn't go to the extreme of another war. So how do we get to today when the United States seem to have had enough of its share of unnecessary wars, Iraq, Afghanistan, and it seems to be willing to get rid of this post-Cold War tradition of international interventions? Is this a good thing? John seems to argue that it is. To a certain extent, probably it is, if it means that the United States would continue to play a major role in the international system by multiplying the instruments in its toolbox. If you look at the way the State Department's budget decreased after the end of the Cold War, and the Defense Department budget skyrocketed after the end of the Cold War, clearly you see that there is a need to rebalance these essential tools of the United States. Yet I feel uncomfortable with the idea of the United States as completely returning to an isolationist mood. John will probably say that there is no danger of this happening anytime soon. And I hope that is the case. That the most difficult thing from my point of view has always been, when you look at the American foreign policy, to find the proper balance between these two very different trends, to return to isolationism or to dominate the world. And to strike a balance somewhere in between is something that the United States sometimes has succeeded in doing, and sometimes, probably very often, has failed to do. Final question. The return of a world of great power competition. John says there is no chance of this happening anytime soon. Both China and Russia are not serious threats to international stability. I agree with him that the emphasis on these two countries as serious threats is probably misplaced or overdone. Yet I feel uneasy, again, and sorry for repeating this, but and a world in which stability will be assured by the jockeying for great power competition between a rising number of great powers. Do I feel safer under Pax Americana and with all its limits and problems that in a world of great power competition? Probably. I'm not willing to take that chance and look for the alternative and try out whether a world of great power alternative, of great power competition would be a better place, frankly. We might have to live through that, but it doesn't make me feel any safer or any better. Sorry for this, it was a bit rambling, I think, but I wanted to pick up on some of the issues that John raised, and I think we still have time for a little discussion about it.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, Poldo. Well, don't tell my students that the United States is isolationist. The United States was never isolationist. Actually, the United States international projection has always been for intervention and the presence. The point is that, it depends on the point of view you look at it, that the United States has been cautious at times. I think we have a problem here in general. Let me say just a few words, and I promise, I'll leave the floor to you. But that we have set a lot of our interpretations and perspectives on the Cold War pattern, where the United States was proactive, of course. It was a confrontation between big powers, while actually the attitude of the United States has been very different, and the United States today is falling back to that kind of position that was quite typical at the beginning of the 20th century. We had a major turning point at the beginning of the century with the two interpretations of American foreign policy by, Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, to give a general perspective on this, that really changed progressively the approach the United States has to foreign policy, and that introduced, in a way, opened the way, and in the end it was World War II, which, was the last straw that drove the United States toward a new conception of its role at the international level. And the Cold War did the rest. And I think what we are witnessing nowadays, it's basically the aftermath of the Cold War and the attempt at reinterpreting the American role at the world level. I think that in the end, yes, we are indeed going toward a power competition and moving toward a multipolar world where the United States will have to be more realistic, drop its ideology progressively, as it has already done to a certain extent, and and agree on a set of basic rules that need to be shared with other emerging powers, overcoming this idea of the confrontation between two or three major great powers that basically rule the world. That was a pattern for the Cold War, and somehow we've, sort of replicated this pattern. We can go on for the entire semester on this. We can get other colleagues involved, Daniela as well, but I just wanted to add these few words to what has been said today. Let's see se ci sono domande anche o osservazioni da parte degli studenti, se volete intervenire, fare domande ovviamente a chi è intervenuto durante la discussione. A proposito, l'ho chiamata in causa, Daniela Huber. Glielo date voi? Sì, sì.
Grazie. Okay, you can hear me. Okay, so I have one observation and one question to John Müller. It was a very interesting presentation. Thank you very much. So the observation is, you have been speaking about how there is more and more the acknowledgement how stupid war is and an aversion to go to war. But maybe we need to couple this also with the observation that we also have a kind of ignorance of war that is actually happening, because maybe interstate war has decreased, but we see a lot of proxy wars, and particularly in the Middle East, there is a proxy war in Yemen between the Saudis and Iran, there is a proxy war in Libya between Turkey and the Emirates, etc. And why do I say ignorance? Because what we do ignore is our own role in these wars, given that there is a massive arms export from both the US and Europe in these conflicts. And this is ignored. We are kind of involved in these conflicts, but we ignore our own role in this. I think this also needs to be addressed, and this ignorance also extends to, we do not even engage in peace building, not even in our own neighborhood, in Syria, in Libya, etc. So that was an observation, and my question is very different. After there was the mob attack on the Capitol in Washington, D.C., I read a lot of commentary in US newspapers which evoked this idea that somehow US interventionism in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Iraq was now striking back on US democracy. And many of this commentary actually evoked Hannah Arendt's thought, on how imperialism, what she wrote on totalitarianism, she wrote how imperialism abroad in the end came back to societies in Europe with very violent consequences, of course. So not to compare these things, but this was evoked in commentary in US newspapers. So I wanted to ask you, what is your assessment, actually, which harm these interventions have done to your US democracy itself? Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Daniela. Before John answers, because I think this John Mueller especially, so that we can put them together, lump them together. No. Okay, John.
Yes, thank you for the excellent question. Two questions, actually. I quite agree with your argument. My argument is that countries don't get into wars with each other anymore, but one of the things they still do is intervene in civil wars. And if you want to call those proxy wars, you can. It's not clear that the United States was fighting Russia in Syria and backing various sides, various countries backing various sides in Yemen. And also a similar thing in which Europe was involved, which was in Yemen, intervening in that civil war. So I think that is a way of fighting wars or dealing with the situation without having to get into the danger of a major war between states. They have all failed miserably. And indeed, the American military has a horrible record since World War II. It has not won any wars except against enemies that didn't exist: Grenada, Panama, the first Gulf War, and Kosovo. And during this century, all three of its major ventures, Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, and to a degree Syria, have proved to be fiascos. I think there's a very strong tendency to not want to do that again, and I think that's the situation the United States is in now. Even Donald Trump was not an interventionist in that sense. Basically said, why do we keep getting into these stupid wars overseas? They cost a lot of money and they don't do anything. As far as the insurrection is concerned, which I think is more like a riot, I don't think it had anything to do with what's going on overseas. If anything, the rioters probably wanted to get out of Afghanistan and out of Iraq. It basically had to do with, they came to the conclusion that the election had been stolen, and they were determined to do something about it, and it turned into trespassing and ramshacking. But I don't think it had much to do with, very much, I mean, people in Belarus protested against bad elections, and what they considered to be bad elections. And similarly in Hong Kong, in 2020, when they ransacked the government parliament building. So I think it is not indication of anything broader overall. I do agree with Leopold basically about the United States remaining involved, and I think, as he points out, that it will remain involved. The United States can hardly withdraw economically from the world. It's too dependent on it, and it wants to be a good citizen. It may not do a good job of it, but it certainly is concerned about global warming and the other threats, and it obviously is affected very much by the problems of global warming, and has to play a role in that area. I do not think that nuclear weapons have ever been very important. In the book, I deal with quite extensively with the Soviet Union, and at no time can you find anybody. You can't find anybody who thought getting to a world that would look anything like World War II would make any sense at all. They were in favor of increasing communism around the world by supporting civil wars in some cases, and in expanding, getting class warfare going and so forth. But never were they very close or very interested in any kind of a war overall. Dwight Eisenhower, I discussed quite extensively, understood this quite well, though he didn't say it publicly because it was politically incorrect, I guess. The Cuban Missile Crisis, I call the Cuban, the crisis, part of the crisis circus. Neither Kennedy nor Khrushchev, from the very, very, very beginning, wanted to get that thing to escalate. Eventually, they worked it out. I don't think we were anywhere near any kind of nuclear war in that case. I don't have a good explanation for why the United States continues to fund this massive military, which has mainly failed to do everything that it's supposed to do, and really quite spectacularly in the course of the 21st century. But it's still there, and there are people. And also, by the way, one final comment. I think great power or any kind of competition is really basically a good thing. If China wants to do something in some area and we don't like it, then we can try, competing against them. That is not war, however. That is simply playing the game. And frequently, cooperation would be very helpful. In the case of Afghanistan, in the case of Syria, I think great power, cooperation to deal with those areas would be very beneficial. The United States has been reluctant to do so, and I think that's a blot on its reputation overall. So let me end on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Good. Okay, so we are drawing close to the end of our meeting today. Do you want to take advantage of any last question? Otherwise, I'll turn to Ambassador Mirakian if she wants to. Thank you. I learned the lesson. See, I'm more alert than you thought. Okay. You wanted to add something.
Volevo aggiungere una cosa che interessa in particolare noi italiani. La linea che ha tenuto il Presidente Draghi a questo G20 straordinario del 12 ottobre è molto importante. Non sono state fatte grandi conclusioni, anche perché il G20 è una sede informale che non può creare obblighi per nessuno. Però voglio dire, quindi si è parlato di emergenza, si è parlato di evitare il collasso economico, l'emergenza umanitaria naturalmente, e poi la lotta al terrorismo, il coordinamento sulla lotta al terrorismo. Ma la cosa centrale di queste conclusioni di Draghi non è scontata, perché forse il professor John Muller direbbe che non è più di moda. Allora, invece no. L'Italia continua a puntare sul multilateralismo, che non è soltanto Europa, è più largo dell'Europa, e pensa che queste grandi crisi, si parla della Siria, dell'Iraq prima, adesso dell'Afghanistan, non è vero che non ci sono le guerre ci sono e come, la gente muore, e queste grandi crisi non si riesce a risolverle, diventano croniche, no? E il punto di Draghi è che nessuno è in grado di agire da solo, né gli Stati Uniti, né la Russia, né la Cina, né la stessa Europa sono in grado di prendere in mano e risolvere da soli queste grandi, enormi tragedie. E allora bisogna, e questo è il punto centrale, e io che mi occupo da una vita di politica estera penso che sia molto importante, soprattutto per i giovani, no? Incollarsi nella mente questa parola, multilateralismo, che vuol dire le crisi si risolvono e le situazioni si gestiscono insieme, il che vuol dire che tu non hai dei nemici, no? Hai degli amici, però ci sono situazioni nel mondo e scenari talmente drammatici che tu devi superare queste inimicizie e reach out. Non ti piacciono i russi? E va bene, devi collaborare anche con loro, perché loro sono in area, adesso parlo di Afghanistan, ma anche di Medio Oriente. Non ti piacciono i turchi? Bene, i turchi devi collaborare anche con loro, perché sono in Libia, perché sono in Siria e perché sono protagonisti regionali nel Mediterraneo. Non ti piacciono i cinesi? Perché ti fanno concorrenza no, devi collaborare anche con loro. Questo è il punto che ha fatto Draghi. Naturalmente non vuol dire condonare, cioè, capito, dimenticarsi che questi non hanno idea dei diritti umani, tutte queste cose, che trattano male questi, quegli altri, che mettono gli uiguri dentro ai campi di concentramento. Non vuol dire questo. Vuol dire che resta il problema, ma su alcuni dossier importanti, internazionali, devi comunque collaborare. Si può parlare anche di clima, naturalmente, di pandemia, eccetera, ma anche sulle crisi. Non si può, nessuno di noi è in grado di risolvere da solo, non l'Italia solo, che è un paese, diciamo, di medio calibro, ma neanche i paesi di grande calibro. E quindi incollate nella vostra mente questa parola, multilateralismo. Grazie.
Grazie. Ambasciatore Mirachian. Allora, tutto sommato, and I'm sorry, John, I'm concluding in Italian. Thank you for your participation. It was a pleasure to have you with us. I'm concluding, and I will say it in Italian again, but I'm concluding with the fact that in the end, although coming from different approaches and different positions, we all agree on a principle that diplomacy, talking, and mediation, it's a much better way to go than the use of force, right?
And the next time you will speak Italian.
Yeah, and we expect you to speak Italian for the next meeting. Take care. Allora, chiudo quindi qui il Festival della Diplomazia con questo ultimo evento. È stato un grandissimo piacere, dobbiamo ringraziare il Festival e in particolar modo Giorgio Bartolomucci, che è sempre attivissimo, iperattivo direi nell'organizzazione. Non lo vedo più qui con noi, sarà scappato a fare qualche dichiarazione per la stampa e annuncio. Io ringrazio tutti voi che avete partecipato a questa opportunità, ce ne saranno altre anche fuori del Festival della Diplomazia. Vi ricordo che il nostro Dipartimento periodicamente fa anche degli incontri sulla politica internazionale, stavo parlando adesso con il professor Nuti, e l'invito anche la collega Daniela Huber a fare tra la fine di quest'anno e l'inizio del prossimo un incontro su temi che interessano tutti noi, tutti e tre, anche gli altri colleghi che sono seduti qui. Federico Antonelli se n'è andato, c'è Paolo Scarlatti, Giordana Pulcini, insomma ce ne abbiamo di forze da mettere in campo, e ovviamente la vostra di partecipazione. Grazie e buona serata.
Vai, va.
Hi, John. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
So I would like to tell you bye. We are closing. We are closing the conference. Can you hear me, John?
Yes, can you hear me? Can you hear me? Anyway, thank you very much.
Just a moment. Just a moment. John, we are closing now. So, bye. We are closing the conference. Thank you. Thank you for participating.
Thank you.